If you don't know how much you're earning and how much you're spending, how can you build a plan about what you can put away, what you can invest? How do you decide whether you can go out for that extra meal out on a Thursday or not? Mm-hmm. How do you decide if you can buy a new car? And so as simple as it sounds, it's really rudimentary stuff, but you've got to start with a budget and you've got to understand how much is coming in and how much is going out.
That was Stafford Hamilton. This is the Noobie Dentist podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Omid Zami. Welcome to episode 4 of the financial mini-series with the Noobie Dentist podcast. I hope you have enjoyed the previous 3 episodes where we've covered a lot of amazing high-yield topics. The download numbers for these financial series have been quite impressive, and I look forward to bringing the audience and the listeners more and more information on these financial aspects of being a young dentist, looking into practice ownership, and beyond. In this episode, I sat down with the CEO of Credabl, Stafford Hamilton. Stafford has over 20 years of experience working in supporting the medical community through financial services. And in this episode, we sort of summarize all the topics that we have touched on in the previous episodes, a blueprint for the young dentist. When to buy a car, when to buy a house, when to buy a practice, and how to sequence these things to maximize your financial flexibility and to build a secure financial future for yourself. We also talk a little bit about personal finance and the importance of financial education in providing you the flexibility to make decisions in your career that aren't guided necessarily by money. Stafford shares his wealth of information with us in this episode, and I hope you guys get as much out of it as I did. This episode of the Noobie Dentist podcast has been proudly supported by specialist medical lender Credabl. If you need finance, be it for your personal or professional needs, the team at Credabl know the drill. From home loans and car loans to equipment and fit-out loans, or even commercial property and practice purchases, the finance specialist at Credabl will provide a tailored solution for you. Learn more at www.credabl.com.au. That's credabl.com.au, where you can learn more and you can live chat with a member of the team 24/7. Without further delay, enjoy this amazing interview with Stafford Hamilton. So I'm joined today by the CEO of Credabl, Mr. Stafford Hamilton. This is the final part of the financial mini-series, and we've covered a lot. So I was hoping today with yourself, Stafford, we'd sort of tie things together and do a bit of a blueprint of financial freedom or wealth creation, whatever it may be for the new grad from 0 to 5 years out. You guys, through the work that you do with Credabl, I'm sure I've worked with a lot of dentists and various stages of their career. So I'm really sort of excited to get your experience and expertise on the subject. Normally, what we do, if you don't mind, is just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll jump into it.
Sure. Thanks, Amit. It's a pleasure to be here. My background is basically I was born in the UK in the 70s, so I'm getting on a bit these days. I moved to South Africa in the early 90s and did about 8 or 9 years there, and moved with my family to Australia in 2002. So my accent's a little bit weird because it's gone to the UK and South Africa and now Australia. And I've been in, I guess, the front end of businesses through all of that. And, people in the front end tend to be a bit of a chameleon. So maybe my accent's changed because of that. But it used to be pretty Oxford, England kind of accent before. Yeah. When I arrived in Australia, I joined a business inside the National Australia Bank. Worked there for a couple of years and then founded a business called Experian in 2004. That business was also focused on supporting the financial ambitions of healthcare professionals, and left there in 2015 and then started Credabl in 2017 as kind of, what I think of as maybe the third generation of financing in this sort of space. And so obviously really proud of what we've managed to build at Credabl so far in the past sort of 4 years, and looking forward to building more in the future.
Excellent. Over the previous 3 episodes, we've sort of covered a lot of topics from, good debt versus bad debt, or whether you should buy a home first or a practice first. And then we had, chats with about the accounting side of things as well, and setting up a practice and the accounting infrastructure that goes with it. Within myself, I'm about 4 years now, so I'm sort of in that stage of, I guess my career where I'm thinking about, buying a practice and buying a house. And focus on the wealth creation side of things. So mostly selfishly, and that's why I do the podcast, I guess, is I get to ask experts things that I'm curious about. But I try and ask these questions thinking that there'll be other people in a similar situation. So let's sort of walk through from your experience, I guess, if you have specific examples of dentists that you've worked with, sort of like a 0 to 5 year, I guess, like a playbook or a blueprint of suggestions and strategies you have. And then if there's anything in between, I'll kind of jump in and we'll try and dive in a little bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the first thing is there's no right answer to that question. I think, I've always focused quite a lot on the human element around this. So people have different aspirations. I think it's really important to build around what it is that you see as your future. So if you take your typical dentist, they're generally graduating reasonably early, relative to other medical professions. Yeah. So, kind of 23, 24, that sort of age group. And so what generally they tend to focus on is I want to get a house. That tends to be the first thing. But one needs to think about whether looking at a business will drive income very differentially to create the ability to buy a different house. So, if I take an example, I very often get calls from young dentists saying, I want to buy a car. And I'm like, okay, what kind of car do you want to buy? Yeah, I want to buy a really cheap one. I don't go very far, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, okay, my experience has been, if you go and buy yourself a $10,000 Corolla that's 5 years old, you're going to be calling me in 12 months and telling me that you want to sell that Corolla and buy something else. Maybe we should talk about something in the middle range. Yeah. I'm not saying buy a Lamborghini, but maybe you want to buy, a new Golf or something like that. So yeah. I think the thing that's important is just working through with people that adjustment, like when you come off being a student, your knee-jerk reaction is, it is quite conservative, and let's use the word tight with money. You've lived on not a lot for quite a long period of time. And so, of course, I understand why you're saying, okay, I want to buy a car. It's just going to get me around. I'm going to do the very minimum. But you've got to think about transaction costs. And anything you do, anything you buy or sell, you've got to think about transaction costs and, what the asset will depreciate between the time you buy it and the time you sell it. Yeah. So the problem that I've got with that strategy is most people, once they get into a routine, and dentists generally, most will earn above $100,000 a year very soon after graduation, if they, join a practice or, getting mentored, etc. And so once you're earning sort of $8,000, $9,000 a month, and that's going into your bank every month, then your mindset will change quite distinctly. Yeah. And I think it's a mistake to make too many decisions until that actual banking of the check has happened. So I always say to people, let's just take a couple of breaths. You graduated in November, you went on holidays and, took a good break, which you should have done. You're starting a new job in January or February. Maybe we shouldn't make any major purchase decisions until March or April and see how you feel about that cash coming into the bank. And then you might decide not to buy the Corolla, you might buy the Golf. Yeah. And Golf will probably see you very, very happy for 3 to 4 years, which will be, a very different equation to buying a Golf and then trading out of it in a year's time. So, I think the first part of the journey is just understanding how your life is going to change and how you should use that change of cash flow. So, first things first is I've got to get to work. It's like, okay, well, let's give you a little bit of an overdraft, just to get you the tools that you need to get to work. I know that, in that early phase of the career, a lot of people are a little bit debt averse, which, I understand. I don't want to push debt out to people that don't want it. Yeah. But I think at the beginning, what you really want is, you've got to buy, some drills and some, a laptop, and you've got to buy some scrubs or whatever it is. You're only talking about 5 to 10 grand, but as a student, that's 5 to 10 grand you don't have. Yeah. Next cab off the rank is usually the car. And then we have that discussion about what's the right car to buy at this point in your career. And then it tends to move on quite quickly. Once the cash is hitting the bank, it tends to move on to, I want to buy a house. And I think the reason for that is really because in that first 2 to 3 years, most dentists that I speak to really want to hone their craft by working with a mentor in another person's practice. And so they don't really feel comfortable to go out on their own and set up a practice or buy somebody else's practice. Because I think, they're really, no pun intended, cutting their teeth in terms of their professional life. And at the end of that period, then they're going to start looking at a practice. So the sequence normally that I see is overdraft to buy some of the things you need just to get out the door and go to work, a car to get you there, then a house, really, because I've got money coming in now, feels like the right thing to do. In Australia, everybody's into property. Yeah. And obviously, I want to do something with the money I'm now earning. And then 2 to 3 years down the line, it's about buying a practice. And then it's a decision point around, am I going to buy somebody else's practice, buy into the one that I'm working in at the moment, or set up something from scratch? So, that's sort of how I see the trajectory of the first, sort of 5 years going. At the end of the 5 years, then you've usually got somebody that, has bought their first property and is now either bought into the practice where they were being mentored, or, have in some way become a business owner, business professional themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when I first graduated dental school, when I was on that holiday that you're speaking of, that's when I was like really trying to learn about, just like, wealth creation and all those sort of things. So, those classic, richest man in Babylon and rich dad, poor dad and all those things. So
yeah,
I had an interesting mindset of like, I don't want to spend money on, things that aren't assets or they're not going to generate income. So, and it's funny because I, like on social media and stuff, I have classmates and they live like a very different sort of like lifestyle to sort of where I live, where I'm saving money, buying, stocks and investments and things. And a lot of people have the nice BMWs and, nicer cars and things like that. So it's funny that it's like that different psychology that people have versus like saving up money to, enjoy down the track maybe versus living in the moment now and enjoying it now. But it's a good point that you bring up with the cars and things like that too. Like you're not going to, if you might save up money up front buying like an old Corolla, but it'll cost you more in the short term because you won't be happy with it, or it'll break down. It'll cost you too much to repair it, or you have to sort of do that early changeover. In terms of this, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, how did it sound when I kind of said that first 5 years? How did it relate to how you've gone about your career so far? Like some similarities, or?
It's I think I'm different in a way because I'm from Canada, so I'm here in Australia right now, and I'm just working as an associate. But because we're not sure long term where if we're going to stay here or go back, so some of those like anchoring moves, like buying the house or buying the practice, has sort of been just pushed down the line a little bit. So that cash flow that was sitting in the account where traditionally I would have bought a house or bought a practice has gone into like investing and things like that. So it's been quite lucky because it's been an interesting year with investing as well since like last March. But I think that's
what I meant when I said there's no single solution to this issue. And I think that's the thing that we try to focus on with our team. It's every situation we go into is unique. And so it's not like a one size fits all. I mean, there's some general trends, but absolutely, like in your situation, you've got to get things like Foreign Investment Review Board approval to be able to buy a property.
Yeah.
And buying it on a visa comes with its own challenges as well, because obviously a lot of lenders will look at that and go, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to stay here permanently, so I'm at risk by lending you the money to buy a property, because the government could turn around and say, sorry, no renewal of your visa. So, I think we go into every situation with a really open mind. I think what I encourage the team to do is, try and not just deliver what the person thinks that they want, because it's like, I want a car, I think I want a Corolla and it's 10 grand and can I have the money? I think let's take a step backwards and try interrogate that a little bit. Why are you buying a Corolla, and what's the long-term plan? And, most of the team at Credabl have been doing this, exclusively with medical professionals for 10, 15, 20 years. Like we've kind of seen it all. And so for us, there's the advice factor around making sure that you make a smart decision. That's really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it comes down to, like you said, it's very individual in terms of interest as well. And I have, so many, like my wife's a doctor, and like all her friends and stuff, even like all of our dental friends, they don't think about investing and that kind of stuff as such. So they're more focused on their career, generating income from their work, and then buying like the things that are more sort of routine or laid out, like buying the house and buying the practice and things like that, versus investing. I'm curious about debt, because that's a really interesting topic, and leverage and all these sort of things, and especially nowadays with what's happening with like interest rates being so low. Has that changed Credabl's approach to lending, or people coming to you guys to get funding for expanding a practice or buying a second home as an investment, or changing houses to a bigger house? Tell me a little bit about that side of things, of how like the global, like the financial lending space has changed in the last couple of years.
Look, I think I'm really proud of the fact that we've always been very consistent. So we haven't changed our style of lending. I mean, we feel really lucky to work with the group that we do, because we can support them through all of the cycles. And we have done, we've been through GFC, we've been through COVID, we've been through all kinds of stuff with this profession. And the one thing that, is really comforting for us is that their earning is consistent throughout. And therefore, it's allowed us to be consistent in how we go about lending throughout. And so we've always done things that the mainstream financiers have thought is a little bit crazy. Like we've lent people 100% to get into commercial property. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we did that was not because we thought we were taking more risk. I mean, it was really related to your first question, which is when somebody was building a practice, they would need to accumulate a 30% deposit in order to buy their practice premises. Mm-hmm. Now, the challenge with that is generally most people have got other career or life ambitions, like you just mentioned, buying a new car, etc. And so saving that 30% of their deposit for their practice premises became very low down on the list of priorities and therefore never happened. And they carried on being perennial renters. And so as a team, we looked at that and said, look, this is the location where people trade. There's a goodwill element to it. It's one of the first bills that gets paid. It's integral to their practice and how they build their practice. We need to lend them all of the money so that we can actually bring it forward in priority and get them to owning their property well before. And so, not to digress too much from your question, but I think the thing we've always tried to think about ways to solve the problems that face the profession. And our lending has been relatively consistent throughout. So we've always lent, 100% for commercial property, 100% for the assets to buy the business, etc. And the variation of interest rates hasn't really changed that very much. What it has done is affected servicing ability. So in other words, obviously, if you have $1 million mortgage with a 2% interest rate, as is floating around at the moment, well, now you're looking at $20,000 of interest rate. Yeah. Wind the clock back sort of 8-10 years, we were at 6 and 7%. Now the interest cost is 60 or 70. I mean, that's a 3 times differential.
Huge, yeah.
So that makes a big difference to people's ability to borrow money. And the size of the investment that they might make. So, the property that somebody would have bought when interest rates are 6 and 7%, that might have been $1 million. Well, now at 2%, it might be 1.5 or $2 million. And so the money goes further, if you like. And the thing that we've seen is very cyclical kind of appetite around lending according to regulation, according to GFC, etc. We've tried to be fairly consistent throughout. So, support their ambitions no matter where we've been in the cycle, which hasn't been easy always because, you're kind of moving against the market. But we have managed to do it.
Yeah, that's great. I think, one of the things that we touched on in previous episodes was the benefits of working with a specialist lender. Given that you guys work with so many doctors and dentists, know specifically what our career arc is like and earning potential and challenges and things. And so it makes it much easier for someone to come to someone like yourself to try and get funding versus going directly to the bank where they might not understand like the nuances of where we are or how things are going to be growing over the next few years. I'm curious, everyone likes, success stories and like cautionary tales and things. Do you have some, obviously without naming names and things, some examples of some people who've excelled in this sort of period of time from like 0 to 5 years have done really well for themselves, and maybe on the other end of the spectrum where some people maybe grew too fast or had to kind of hone it back in before they started growing again?
There are plenty floating around. Look, I think there are loads and loads of cliches about, how to be astute. You mentioned some of the books that you read when you were on holiday. Cash is king and, fail to plan to fail, that sort of thing. I think the people that I have seen that have been the most successful, they've really surrounded themselves with experts and knowledge from the get-go. And whether that's a financier or whether it's, accountant, the style of accountant that you choose, there are different accountants out there. There are accountants that will really just deliver a tax return and they'll do it for a lot of people. And there are people that will spend a lot of time with an individual client and build a plan around them. There's a cost differential. You can't get service without cost. Yeah. So, somebody that says, look, I just want a tax return, will get the service that they've asked for, and that will just be a tax return. That's not going to help them with wealth creation. Somebody that wants to go down a path of wealth creation needs to accept that somebody's going to have to invest 6, 10, 15 hours, on a biannual basis, basically, to make sure that they understand the situation and that they're building a plan accordingly. And so the people that I've seen that have done the best have surrounded themselves with those experts from the beginning. The second thing is they've faced the cold, hard reality of what their budget looks like. So the number of people I sit with that I say to them, do you have a budget? And I get like a very blank look back in exchange is quite scary for me because, clearly it's my field. So I run my own accounts like a business.
Yeah.
And so I know everything that comes in and everything that goes out every single month. I know the excess and I know when I've overspent. And I found that by and large, I think that most people that don't have a budget, it's because they don't want to know. They
Ignorance is bliss. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I actually think ignorance is anxiety, because I think it's something that they've chosen not to do, and they know that they ought to do it, and not knowing how much comes in and how much. If you don't know how much you're earning and how much you're spending, how can you build a plan about what you can put away, what you can invest? How do you decide whether you can go out for that extra meal out on a Thursday or not? How do you decide if you can buy a new car? And so as simple as it sounds, it's really rudimentary stuff, but you've got to start with a budget, and you've got to understand how much is coming in and how much is going out. And in the early days of a career, similarly to running a business, I often say to, young medical students, particularly who tend to earn a little bit less than, immediate graduating dentists. I often say to them, it's okay to go backwards for a year or two, because I know where your income is going. Yeah. So if you make a conscious decision, look, I earn $8,000 a month and I'm going to spend $8,000, but I'm going to keep it at $8,000. And as my income trajectory goes up from 100,000 to 200,000, that surplus is not going to just disappear into, more meals out. That's okay. But you've got to have a plan. You've got to know what you're dealing with in order to make those decisions. And, it's similar to, like I said, starting a business. Very often chatting to people, starting a business is a costly enterprise. And, it's not something that you get trained on, not really in any medical, dental, or healthcare degree that I'm aware of, because I think there's so much volume to get through in terms of medicine itself. But I think, without that training, obviously, then you emerge and you think about setting up a business like, I don't really know where to start. And the number one thing I say to people is, when you start a business, you are going to run at a deficit. You are going to run at a loss. And so similarly, you can think about your career path that way a little bit. It's like, I'm going to run it, if you want to do it this way, I'm going to make a conscious decision to run at a loss for a year or two, but my income is going to move ahead of that. And then when that income moves ahead, then I'm going to move on to buying a house, buying a car, doing all these extra things. The problem that I see that causes most people to fail is that they just keep spending as their income goes up with no regard to what's coming in and what's going out. And, it's honestly, I think it's that basic, because then once you start doing that, like you've mentioned, even if it's only $2,000 a month, I think a lot of people look at it and say, I only have $2,000 a month to do anything with. I can't buy a house. I'm going to have to save up for however many months. Well, the hard truth is you've got to start somewhere. So take that $2,000 a month and invest it in, stocks, possibly. Maybe buy an index fund, buy something that has the top ASX 100 companies, and just keep putting $2,000 in there. And with dividends and capital gains and $2,000 a month, actually what will happen is that period will shorten right in front of you. But you've got to start somewhere. You can't just accept defeat.
Yeah, that's great. And it's interesting with the budget, because how I've, and it's definitely not the only way or the right way at all, but how I normally do it is I'm not like strict of, okay, I'm gonna have like X amount of dollars for meals and entertainment, but I just, every time I get paid, we've had since I started working, was just take 30% gross off the top into savings, and then whatever's left is left. Like if I'm running out of money, then I'm running out of money, and that's how, but then you've put your savings away before you spend anything at all, and then that's sort of
absolutely. And that is also a great plan, like the so-called bucketing plan, which there's nothing wrong with that at all. Like I just, from a personal point of view, you would never run a business without doing your accounts, right? Like you'd have a bookkeeper, you'd run. And so I just say, it doesn't make sense to me, but I'm a financial person. I'm like, why would you not just run your personal finances like you run a business? Like I run Xero for my own personal finances. all of the stuff feeds in.
Mm-hmm.
It literally takes me 7 to 8 minutes a day to update everything. And anytime, my family's going crazy with spending, I could just call up a profit and loss and say, guys, it's enough already. And so for me, I guess it's one of those things where I find it hard to understand, but I think it's probably like that for a medical professional. When you see somebody that's not brushing their teeth or not exercising, you're like, why do you not do that? Like, it's just so obvious that you should.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And I think it is like one of those things where like that discipline like leads to freedom down the track, but a lot of people like lack that discipline to like have, strict books on their personal finances. It's interesting with like the lifestyle. You say, start making $8,000 a month and then your income goes up. But I think that's the problem most of us face is the income goes up and then our lifestyle kind of keeps up with it. So we always struggle to like save money. So I think that's like the challenge. Even if you can make it lag behind by a few years at least, then you can accrue a lump sum that becomes a down payment for a house or a down payment for a practice.
Yeah, I was just going to say that what you want is a bit of a lag effect. So, okay, so, I'm not saying, live like a monk, from that day onwards and bank every dollar of increases. But, if you move from 100,000 to 200,000, which would be, fairly common for a dentist in the course of the first probably 2 to 3 years of their career. Mm-hmm. If you're moving up by $100,000, then as you say, bucket 30% of that increase. So achieve a standard of living that is comfortable, like you've worked hard. I'm not one of these guys that says you should live like a monk. I'm saying you've worked hard, you deserve a good lifestyle, you should have fun, you should go on holidays, et cetera, et cetera. But when you see your income increasing, how much of that should you bucket to the, I don't need actually to increase my lifestyle exponentially. I actually, just a little bit better is good. And I'm putting 50% of my extra $100,000 away every year.
Yeah. And there's a lot to be said about the freedom it creates. Like I worked in private practice for 3 years and, doing that bucket system, like, 30% aside, I decided to take like a public hospital job to like just learn some oral surgery last year. And it was pretty much like a 50% pay cut, but like having that lifestyle be where it was and having that savings where it was, like allowed that transition to happen without too much stress or nothing essentially changed in our life because the lifestyle hadn't kind of got out of control just yet. But I think that's, and you can days and all those things, like you can buy time back if you're just like disciplined a little bit with the financial side.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned before that old adage, cash is king, but that really is what sinks people and gets them into trouble. And so the question you've got to ask yourself is, if I needed an emergency, depending on your lifestyle, but if I needed an emergency $20,000, where would it come from? Mm-hmm. And if you can't answer that question without saying, well, I'd have to wait for a paycheck, then you've got a problem. And I think that causes a lot of anxiety and, real freedom in my way of looking at the world, real freedom comes from knowing where that comes from. Yeah. And so then you can act and think differently. So like you say, you can make a career choice that is very different. But if you haven't got that kind of backstop, you can't make that career choice. Mm-hmm. You have to keep, doing things the way you've done them before in order to bank the paycheck, just to keep swimming. So, yeah. And
in terms of the practice ownership front, from people who you've worked with, because I know it's like a big debate, like, and you touched on it briefly in the initial bit in terms of, buying into an existing practice or opening one from scratch. The people who you see make that decision, so say they're 5 years out and they've got the clinical scope and they feel comfortable to step into a practice ownership role to be the principal dentist. How does that next 5 years play out for both those camps where I've bought into an existing practice where there's existing cash flow, but I've taken on maybe more debt to acquire that practice, or I've, spent maybe $400,000, $500,000 to, do a fit out and start from scratch with no income to start. How do you see that play out like the next 5 years for those two like camps of people?
Yeah. Again, probably a strange answer from a financier, but I think it's actually about personality. Mm-hmm. Different people have different risk appetites. Different people, are more comfortable running a business and not running a business. So I think, we try to work with people and say, okay, like with what you're comfortable with, setting up a practice might just be more risk than you are going to be comfortable with. Like at the end of the day, we just want people to sleep at night, and so if you're somebody that's kind of risk averse and maybe, not feeling really confident about, your practice skills at that point in time, then maybe buying into a practice is the right solution for you because you're going to still be surrounded by colleagues. there's going to be a certain amount of cash flow that comes in from day one. So yes, you're going to lay out potentially more, to buy the goodwill. And it's very tempting for people to reject that notion because they're like, well, why would I buy something that I can build? But if it's the right solution for you and maybe you can build it bigger than it is when you buy it, it's a little bit like buying a house that can be renovated. Like if you see a dilapidated house and I'm not saying practices are dilapidated, of course, but if you see an opportunity there to take a property that's there and improve it, well, that's just as smart a way of going about it as it is to go and buy a brand new house or build a brand new house. And so, again, before we even get to the money, I think we need to talk about the individual and, how comfortable they are. Building a business is a really different thing to working in a business. And so I think you have to think about that. People management is a massive, obstacle or challenge for anybody that runs a business. And, you have to think about that very carefully. You have to run your own cash flow. You have, you're ultimately making all these decisions that are quite different. Then when it comes down to the magnitude, well, recently it's become, quite an expensive enterprise to get into practice. Like if you take a dental practice now, when I first started doing this, not to show my age, but probably we would see people setting up practice for about $150,000.
Wow.
Now it can be $500,000. There's so many things that you can put into a practice. There's so much technology, there's so much sophistication, and you have to decide what is the right level of technology and sophistication for the practice you think you can build. So, you don't necessarily have to have, put in, the most advanced X-ray, you might just take a simple intraoral because that's the kind of practice that you want to build, or you might want to put that technology into the practice once you've got a little bit of cash flow going. So again, we try to work through with people what their tolerances are. If they're going to be very uncomfortable with the idea of big repayments, that negative in the first 6 to 9 months being quite significant, then we will probably work with them to scale that back a little bit and say, okay, why don't we establish cash flow and build the practice a little bit more moderately? Some people really want everything on day one. They've worked in, a high yielding practice, that's the kind of practice that, the kind of surgery that they're used to doing, and they want all the bells and whistles from the first day. And so the differential now between buying and setting up a practice is probably, less than it was, in my view, years ago.
And because obviously it takes, you're going to be cash flow negative for a while. And from my understanding, most lending goes towards fit out, but you don't necessarily get working capital. Is that correct? So how do people are people working like a part-time associateship on the side to maintain some sort of cash flow, or just coming in with like a lot of personal savings into this sort of project?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people still work somewhere else, partly because if you think about it, it's a bit of a transition. So we're talking about, let's say on average, 3 to 4 years is really where I think most people start thinking, hey, it's time for me to do something. And at that point, they still probably love and enjoy being around other practitioners, and getting advice on, the treatment plan or the procedure they're about to do. And so I would say more often than not, we see people working in their existing practice and setting up somewhere else. They tend to set up quite far away from the existing practice simply because obviously they don't want there to be any conflict, and they don't want the practice that they're in to think that they're trying to take the patients. They just want to build their own business. And so I would say more often than not, they're transitioning by, 2 days, in the existing practice they work in, or 3 days, and then gradually building up the other practice that they've gone into. But there are people that just cut the cord on day one, use their savings and open up their practice, and start from nothing effectively.
Go all in.
I think they've got to be more comfortable with the idea of going bigger into the red before they kind of come out. But I think it's your question about working capital. I think you've got to look for a holistic solution. So you need somebody that's going to support you if your business plan doesn't quite go to plan. You need obviously fit out to put in your cabinetry and all of the things that you need to be a practitioner. Obviously you need equipment, and you've got to decide what equipment is right for you because there's lots of different suppliers. Most people, I guess, tend to go with one of two. Either they go with what they trained on when they were graduating, or they go with what they're working on at the moment in the practice they're in. You don't very often see people suddenly, switching brand to something else, when they start their new practice. So, it's a holistic solution. You need the fit out, the equipment, the overdraft facility, and I think you need a friendly advisor, when things aren't quite going to plan, that doesn't just say, look, we gave you the money we gave you and that's the end of it. We're cutting off the tap. You need somebody that understands and goes, okay, I think you're doing all the right things, but maybe we should introduce you to this, partner, and they could help you maybe ramp up that area of your practice. And that, I think, is what our team, works with people on.
Yeah, definitely. Surrounding yourself with the right people is really important to like getting success in anything, really, even in dentistry, like you said, with mentorship and things, but especially in setting up a business, you want to be with people you can go to for advice and get their expertise. And I'm curious about sort of once you have a practice, are you seeing, because this is a debate I have with my friends all the time, is, because everyone has their like ideal, I want to own like 3 practices, or I want to like do this and that. Yeah. You find the more successful formula is multiple practice ownership, or like one really well-run bigger practice?
We could debate this too. Look, I certainly think there is like on my training, I'm an economist. And so my training tells me that there's diminishing returns on multiple practices. Now, that isn't to say that you can't do well from multiple, but I think that spreading yourself across practices, unless somebody's invested as an owner in the business, nobody else acts the same way, and you shouldn't expect them to. Somebody that works in your business is not going to act the same as somebody that works and owns. Yeah. And so naturally you're going to get diminishing returns, because if you have 3 practices, well, even a really hardworking dentist probably can't do more than 2 days in each, which means that each one of them has 4 days without you. And so just from a psychological point of view, you can understand why that business can't run the same way as the one where you're in it 6 days a week. Yeah. However, of course, there's the issue around scale, because if you've got 3 practices in 3 different locations, then you've got a different scale of business. So let's say, for example, that you're a general dentist and you have your first practice and you bill $700,000 a year, and you're netting, say, $200,000 a year. When you open up your second one, you might still achieve $700,000 of billings, but I don't think that you will see $200,000 coming in the bottom line, because you've got to pay somebody to work there the other days, etc. But it doesn't mean it's a bad investment, because obviously you could make multiples. I think the thing that's the biggest challenge with having multiple practices is the management that goes with it. Yeah. The time management, remotely managing people that work for you from a distance, not having them like right under your nose. A lot of people find it quite difficult not to see what's going on. And so we often see people opening a second practice or buying a second practice, and within a couple of years selling it or exiting it from the second one, because they just simply don't enjoy the experience. Yeah. But yeah, I think definitely diminishing returns, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad strategy.
That's right. Yeah, I guess the model I have in mind always, again, it's like a future sort of way I've envisioned things going, is maybe have if there's like a few procedures that you really enjoy doing, kind of going between your 3 practices or 2 practices, focusing on those 2 or 3 procedors. And then, some sort of partnership, because, even from these small, the podcast and like other stuff that I run with some friends, you realize how important like equity is, or like skin in the game is, for people to actually care. So that'd be something that I would think about, is maybe the associate dentists that work those other practices would also be like part owners at maybe a minority stake, but still have some skin in the game. So they actually, like, when they're there, they care more so than just like an associate would care.
Yeah. I guess when you mention something like that, the immediate thing that springs to mind to me is please, please, please have a partnership agreement.
Yeah.
Just something that regulates your relationship from a business point of view. I see a lot of people getting into business and they're mates, and unfortunately you need to have a mechanism for what happens if this happens. Yeah. And because you'll come at it from different angles. And like, I've seen lots of partners that are great mates and that are, both have valid viewpoints, arrive at a decision point and unable to make the decision because they just can't agree. And it's so much easier to agree it academically beforehand. It's like, what if this happens? What will we do? Like, what if one of us dies? What will we do? What if, like all of these kind of things. So it's like, please, whenever you work,
great point.
Please get a partnership agreement, honestly. and sometimes we even condition that in our credit, because I don't see any reason for it to be conflict. And so very often when we've got, mates coming out of uni and we're lending to them, and we sometimes get a bit of resistance to it. I'm like, we'll approve this. We'll definitely support you, but we want to see your partnership agreement. And there's sometimes they think we're overstepping. And it's simply because I've seen so many difficult situations arise from not having one. And I'm like, I just don't want to see you guys in that situation.
Yeah, it's bad. It can get messy pretty quickly.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I think we touched on a lot of really, important topics, and I love this stuff because it's really important. I over the past couple of years, as you learn more and more about finances and wealth and accounting and investing, the more you kind of enjoy it. And I treat it like as a bit of a game, and I think the game is to get to retirement and have enough money to retire if you want. Like, never have, if you don't have financial hardship in your life, then you've sort of beat the game at a basic level. So I hope these past, 3 or 4 episodes have been really helpful for other dentists, because I know that's not the case, that everyone thinks about this stuff all the time. It's just, if you care about it, or if you are interested in it, then you start kind of go down the rabbit hole a little bit more. But having the opportunity to chat with yourself and the other team members at Credabl and getting to pick their brain about these topics has been really exciting. Is there any last minute pointers or advice or anything that you have for the young dentists listening before we wrap up, Stafford?
Look, I mean, I said it before, but I think not only in your business life, but professionally, like follow the method that you've used in your profession. Surround yourself with advisors, mentors, professors. You've done it all the way through your training career, and you're doing it in the early part of your professional career. And it's the same with running a business. Just surround yourself with people that can give you insights. And, like I always say, something that's free is valueless. And so, when you go looking for somebody that, gives you advice, but there's no cost to that advice, does it really have value? Like working with professional groups costs money. Lawyers, accountants, all these professional services, they cost money for a reason, because they'll help you know what you don't know. And so I think that's, start sooner rather than later. And I think acknowledge that advice comes at a cost. And I'm like, obviously finance comes at a cost, but I'm really talking about more the people you surround yourself with. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get good value out of it, you've got to, don't look for the lowest cost. Look for somebody that you resonate with, that you think understands who you are as a person, and, charges you fairly to tell you the things that you don't know.
Yeah, that's amazing advice. One of my dental mentors, I remember when I first graduated, said, no CPD or no dental course under $1,000 is worth your time going to. And I think that's the same, like the most, successful practice owners that friends of mine, they spend a lot of money on, joining business masterminds and getting business coaches and talking to consultants and all these sort of things. So it's one of those things where the more money you spend, the more money you can earn, because you just get better, high value advice that people have spent a lot of time learning. So you got to pay for that, which makes sense.
How many times have you had somebody come in and say, oh, I think the guy around the corner will do a crown for, $400, and you just think,
go for it.
Exactly. It costs money to do things well.
Yeah. I think that's, and I've brought this up in the previous episode as well, like that shopping on price. We as healthcare professionals, we see patients doing that, and we want to try and convey that it's not the cheapest that's the best. Like it's not a, it's not a Kit Kat bar where you can buy it at the movie theater for $5 and then go to the grocery store and it's $1. It's not the same between the two. So you shouldn't treat it like the same. So thanks again. That was a really insightful episode. A lot of fun, exciting topics. I think a lot of people get a lot of value from it. I will put your Credabl's information in the show notes. So if anyone's interested in learning more about the lending services available, definitely encourage you guys to check it out. Like we said, you got to get some expert advice on these topics. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Aaron. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Noobie Dentist podcast. please be sure to subscribe and head over to iTunes and give the show a 5-star rating. For all show notes and to access all previous episodes, head over to www.noobiedentist.com. Have a great day.